Hello. Uh, so I recently did some videos about people being suicidal, uh, using a killer drug like synthetic marijuana, a certain batch that ended up in the DC region, having killed several people, and how that people go out and they want some of this killer drug, even if they hear that it's killing people. Uh, and I've talked about how in these two previous videos that I did recently, I talked about how the homeless people oftentimes just uh, feel hopeless or like they don't belong or what have you. They're looking for something different. Well, as I continue to think about this and as I continue to try and condense my thoughts into shorter videos, the first one having been over a half hour, the second one having been almost 15 minutes. I'm trying to make this one less than 8 minutes. But as I think these things through, uh, it occurred to me that not all that long ago, maybe a few months, not quite a year ago, I was pointing out how that it's easier to have conversations about life's various grim realities with the homeless than it is to have those conversations with housed people. And when I talk to housed people about the issues of the day, about Trump and other dirty politicians, about homelessness, about poverty, about war, about the various social ills and problems that we have in the world, housed people at some point tend to say, well, hey, let's talk about something positive now. On the contrary, as I pointed out within the last year, I can sit down to lunch at a place where they feed the homeless, and we can talk about the issues of the day. We can bring up a newspaper article about this or that atrocity, and the homeless generally don't say, hey, let's get off this conversation. Let's talk about something nice. Let's talk about flowers and pretty things. But there's a different mentality, and some might say, well, because so and so is housed, their thinking is apparently the better thinking. I would argue that that's not entirely true, and as it says in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 verse 11, a verse that I learned back in the early 90s, I arose and looked unto the sun and saw that the race is not always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, but time and chance happeneth to them all. So it doesn't matter how good or bad you are, good things and bad things can happen to you. So good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people. That's the thought of that verse, Ecclesiastes chapter 9 verse 11. And there's that song Time and Chance, which kind of brings that out. For those of you who don't know what the song I'm talking about, you might call it Don't It Hurt So Bad. I climbed the climb of faith before the fall. A good man's down while a bad man's standing tall. The strongest one don't always win 'em all. I'm going crazy, it drives me so crazy. Ooh, time and chance, don't it hurt so bad? And it hurts so bad. Ooh, time and chance, don't it hurt so bad? Yes, it hurts so bad. But anyway, check it out. I didn't exactly do the song justice, but I've thought also about the concept of the rapture. So there is the event called the rapture, which hasn't taken place yet, and then there's the concept. So the actual event, which is referred to as the rapture, is where Jesus comes along and he drops off the 144,000. The third and final level of godly sovereignty, if you will, and he takes all the true Christians out with him. And then the 144,000 go through the tribulation with the rest of the world after having a mark put on their foreheads, as they get marked as belonging to Jesus. And so Jesus takes out the, shall I say, the high quality Christians, those who have passed the tests that were given up until that point in time, not counting the tribulation, which is yet another test. And then there's this lower level of sovereignty is established as the 144,000 move among those who remain, who didn't get caught up in the rapture. And those 7 years of tribulation are like the final chance people have to get it right. But anyway, so you have Jesus, who is the second level of sovereignty under God, who's pulling his people out of the world, and then he's dropping off the 144,000 to divvy up the remaining people and to lord over them. And of course, you have a lower standard with each lower level of sovereignty. As you go from God to Jesus, that's the concept of salvation in a nutshell, is that God is very harsh and hard to please. Jesus is a lower level of authority who's easier to please. The 144,000 are the final level of sovereign authority in the eternal picture, and they're the easiest to please. And if you don't please them, then you end up in the lake of fire. But that said, this concept of rapture, I would imagine it gets used in places in the world where men are allowed to have multiple wives. A man might have 5 wives. Each wife might have 1 son and 4 daughters. And when those sons get to be somewhere between the ages of 7 and 10, I'm just guessing here, then that man may pull them out of his harem and say, you're no longer responsible to your mother, you're now responsible to me. I'm going to give you orders before I leave for work each day, and when I get home, you'd better have followed my orders, otherwise you're going to be in some big trouble. You're no longer under your mother, you're now under me. And so in this scenario, the man would be the equivalent of Jesus, and his wives would be the equivalent of the 144,000. So you're rapturing people out and saying, hey, I have a different standard. And so I also think of Karl Marx and how that he said, correctly so, that a new system will not be created and come together until the various elements of that new system exist within the old. And I'm over 8 minutes, so the heck with keeping it short. But I believe that the homeless and the poor are bringing forth a way of thinking that is very relevant and that needs to be organized, if you will. They need a leader who can just kind of rapture them out, and maybe not calling them up into the air, but who can pull them together as a unit and say, we have these 10 guys in this county who think this way, and 20 guys in another county, and 10,000 guys in another state, and gals too, who think this certain way. Let's pull them all together and let's form a nation from these people who are scattered throughout different parts of the country, different parts of the world, and who have this way of thinking where they feel like they don't belong because they're such a small fraction of the overall society. If you have 1 million people the world over who think a certain way, then they're spread pretty thin. Out of 7 billion people, that's 1/7,000th of the world population. And so they might feel like, hey, nobody else around me believes as I do. But then when they find out that there's 1 million of them in the world that think that way, then it's like, can we carve out a part of the world for this 1 million people so they can all come together, so they can get raptured into this one area, and they can all live according to their shared beliefs. And that's kind of what's going to happen when Jesus raptures his people out of the world. He's going to get some true Christians from Russia and China and the US and El Salvador and bring them all together and say, okay, well, you're a small fraction of the total world population, but who knows, there may be 10 million, even 100 million people who Jesus Christ labels as true Christians who are doing enough of his will, and he pulls them from the different parts of the world and sets them all together in one contiguous area so they can all live according to their shared beliefs. And that's kind of what the poor and the homeless need, because there are some elements of their thinking that are not bad, that are not crazy, but their thinking is not the standard, and they need to be pulled together into a contiguous area where their thinking becomes the standard for that area, and they're around others like them. And that begins to explain why some people get tied to the shelter environment. There have been homeless people who have been housed and who go back to hang out with their friends from the shelter because they can relate, and so that said, I think that the elements of a new system or of a new way of thinking have been created within the old, and it's time to pull folk together. And as with any society, you have different levels of intelligence and different levels of ability, including the ability to express oneself. And so, who knows, I might be a priest of sorts, in the sense that I'm able to articulate much of what homeless people and poor people have to say, and I can articulate it in a somewhat diplomatic manner. And so I'm sure that all of us are familiar with how there are national core values that get expressed well by the diplomatic types in the upper ranks of our society, and those same national core values don't get expressed so well by the average person. So that said, maybe what I should be focused on going forward is pulling together enough homeless people to help and better define the thinking, our shared thinking, that is quite intelligent and that is quite relevant to this day and age, but which doesn't get a lot of airtime because it gets drowned out by the louder noise of the larger majority. And so just because your thinking is not the majority thinking doesn't mean that it's not relevant. And so that's kind of the issue here. But we should find a way to bring poor people, homeless people together, not always just for the purpose of ending poverty, ending homelessness, but for the purpose of figuring out what the shared elements of our thought processes are, and how those shared elements can be effectively expressed and implemented and acted upon in some way, shape, form, or fashion, so that we can have a community which is not necessarily built around poverty and homelessness, but which is built around the values that are shared by homeless and poor people. Values which can also translate into housed living and into non-poor living. For instance, there are anecdotes I could give if I wanted to make this longer than a 15-minute video, which would show that poor people tend to be more generous than wealthy people, and more caring about their fellow human being. As a matter of fact, I may just pull up a video that I know of that kind of makes that point and post it on Facebook as well when I put this up. All right, with that, I'm done.